Okay, here is for me take two. This is news to you, but I just recorded this lecture once. It was very late at night. I recorded this lecture and I deleted it. So after some consternation, I have decided to sit down and re-record it. So if there's an element of rage in my voice, it's not that I'm, getting into the spirit of the revolution, as much as it is that I'm, wishing I could get into the spirit of not being awake. So let's get through this quickly. Just the facts. I'll move through the kind of review here at the beginning. England spends a lot of money defending the United States. England spends a lot of money really defeating the French. Make sure this thing is working. Let's just hope the audio is working here. Let me pause it and double check. I don't normally pause. I usually just try to go through, but let's just pause and make sure here because I'd hate to do this a second time. Okay, I think everything seems to be okay here. Okay, 7 Years' War. George Washington starts it, right? England wins in the end, but not without spending a lot of money on the battles, and you see it here in this graph. Look, colonies got to pay up, man. It's to defend you. It's defend the colonies. You started it. You got to pay up. They got a lot of debt, and they got to make sure they got to send troops to the colonies to keep the colonists in line, to keep the story is to keep Native Americans where they are and to keep the French protected. But the colonists kind of think it's to keep them in line. And again, this is one of the things that sets the stage for rebellion, right? The pushing the debt onto the colonists without the colonists having a say in it. Okay. Salutary neglect is the time period that is the thing that ends. Let's remember what salutary neglect is. It is associated with Prime Minister Robert Walpole, 1721-1742. It is basically, right, so we have mercantilism. It's a thing. Everyone in Europe is buying it. The English have laws that govern the mercantile economy, mercantile trade. Those laws are called the Navigation Acts, right? All that stuff about mercantile colonies can only trade with the mother country. They can't trade between each other. They send raw materials to the metropole. They send finished goods back, all that stuff. England says, look, yeah, we got these Navigation Acts. They're on the books beginning in the mid-1600s, but colonies are far away. We're making money. And look, we're fighting Spain and France. We got a lot of problems. So we're not going to enforce them. That period is called salutary neglect because it's neglect that's good for you, beneficial, right? Okay, they got a ton of debt. They look at the books. They go, yeesh, right? We got to pay off this debt. We need money. They're ending salutary neglect. The person most associated with is Prime Minister George Grenville. He's not around for a long time, but he is around for a bad time if you're a colonist. The first major act under Grenville's tenure is the Sugar Act, 1764. It's just that. It taxes sugar and then molasses, which a lot of Boston merchants get from the West Indies, and they make rum out of it, and they sell the rum, and they make a ton of money. So the people who are protesting the Sugar Act are not just like poor English who want sugar in their tea or something, right? This is wealthy merchants in Boston. It's aimed at them. It's seen as a good way to raise revenue. These people are making money anyway. The sugar trade is going really well. A lot of people avoid it. They continue with the black market. Others either absorb the cost and then eventually kick it down to the consumer. So basically, if you're a merchant and you're buying thousands of pounds of molasses a year and you have to pay a tax on that molasses, you're not just going to make less money because you have to pay the tax. You're going to roll that cost of that tax into your product. But of course, it's thousands of pounds. So once it gets into a sugar cube in someone's tea or a bottle of rum or what have you, the cost is going to be almost, you won't even notice as a consumer. So, right, that's how it's not really a huge deal. But they complain, right? They complain nonetheless because they're used to not being taxed at all because they're on the black market. If they get caught, in smuggling, they will be sent to admiralty courts. This is a big deal because, as I said in a previous lecture, historically, the British colonists are tried locally. They know the people on the jury. They go, hey, guy, come on, man. Right. As you can imagine, the guilty verdicts are not very frequent. Juries can also just nullify the law altogether. If they don't like a law, they say it's not just. We don't agree with the law. That is that element of commons democracy, right? That people had a role in administering justice. They liked that. Does it make sense to like our modern understanding of the rule of law? Absolutely not. But to the colonists, that made sense to them, right? That was their understanding of commons democracy. And admiralty courts would take that away from them, right? So instead of just being tried in Boston for breaking a law in Boston, suddenly you might be tried in Nova Scotia or in Barbados or London, and that likelihood that you'd be convicted far higher. So keep that in mind, because it's one of these things that as I go through the lecture here and the next one, there's these various points where if you're paying attention, you'll go, that's part of the Bill of Rights, right? The first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And if you're paying attention to the revolutionary history, it's not as though the people who wrote the Bill of Rights had a time machine and they're like, oh, people in the 21st century are going to want X, Y, and Z. Yeah, sure, they were thinking towards the future, but more than anything, they were reacting to the past. So like, admiralty courts, you go, oh, right, trial by jury. When we look at Lexington and Concord, it's, oh, right, that's why they wanted the guns. They were going to take the weapons. The Zenger case, right, with freedom of the press. All of this stuff, you can go almost point by point in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Again, that is the Bill of Rights. And say, oh, this is this, and this is this, and this is this. Admiralty courts, one of them. Quartering Act is just that. We got a bunch of soldiers. We're trying to make it cheap, let them stay in barracks, let them stay in your barns, feed them. They're not staying in your house yet. There's a second Quartering Act that comes later. It's a little bit more, sketchy when it's the soldiers can stay in your house, right? The colonists don't like it as much. And then the Stamp Act. This is a big deal for a lot of historians. For a long time, the Stamp Act was like the definitive moment in the Revolution. Largely because it's an instance of what historians call consensus history. It is a way of writing American history in a way that elides difference, that papers over conflict, that ignores the that slavery thing wasn't good, and says, look, this is something we all can we all agree that the Stamp Act was terrible? And people do. They go, yeah, Stamp Act was terrible. So that is an example of consensus history. Like, let's tell the story of American history in a way that just makes us feel good. People stopped doing it in the 1950s, right? But again, surely a mention of consensus history or something to that effect will reemerge in the not so distant future. But it's a garbage way of doing history. You can handle some that's historical nuance. We can do it. We can talk about conflict and still move the narrative forward. Anyway, all that to say, Stamp Act, no one likes it. And no one likes it because it's a direct tax. So this is something that the colonists are actually going to feel. Unlike the Sugar Act, this directly affects people. Anytime you buy anything that has anything to do with paper. So if your dice come in a little paper thing and you like rolling dice, you're going to pay that tax. If you're getting married, right, you're going to pay that tax. You see, rates of marriage decrease a little bit at this point because people don't want to pay the tax to do it. Any legal documents, you got to pay the tax. Newspapers. Remember the last lecture how I talked about all of that printing, all of that print culture, all these people with printing presses. You got to pay a tax, right? So you got to pay for that stamp, put the stamp on the paper. It says you paid the tax. And then obviously everything's going to cost more money. It's a direct tax on the colonists. They don't like it. The idea of representation, right? They say we shouldn't be paying these taxes. We don't have representation in Congress. Parliament, getting ahead of myself here. We don't have representation in Parliament. So the colonists say this isn't fair. right? We want actual legitimate representation. Parliament says you have virtual representation. You virtually have it. Now, this to us in the 21st century might sound like a bunch of nonsense because we're so well versed in democracy that we even forget about it, right? To our detriment. We forget what it actually means. But this is a big deal, right? Back then, that like, look, virtual representation is fine. Like, what do you like? Do you bumpkin colonists want to send over someone in Parliament and have them represent you? It'll take them a long time to get here. It'll take them a long time to get back. Doesn't make any sense. You're British citizens. Parliament passes laws in the best interest of all British citizens, right? So you have virtual representation. Which side is correct? I mean, if you're a 21st century American, you're obviously like, you're more inclined to say that actual representation is a real thing. But like, given the context of the time period, one could say, look, maybe Parliament has a point. Maybe they don't. Probably don't. Again, Stamp Act Congress. As I said, people don't like it. They get together. They say, let's talk about this thing. Let's figure out what we want to do. 9 colonies get together. Remember, previous lecture, I talked about the Albany Plan of Union, Ben Franklin getting the troops together for attacking the French and Indians, and also trying for some modicum of self-rule. Only 7 colonies show up. Now 9 show up 10 years later. A little bit more buy-in. That's important, right? The colonies, again, starting to think about themselves like, you pay this tax, I pay this tax, none of us like it. Let's get together and see what we can do. They appeal to the king and Parliament. This is important, right? Stamp Act Congress, they're appealing to king and Parliament, saying, this is a problem. We want representation, right? We want to have members in Parliament to have a say in whether we're paying taxes or not. Please, Parliament, please, king, let us have this. That's going to change. As we get move a little bit closer to revolution, it's going to be, king, we like you. We're loyal subjects. Parliament is the problem, right? It's like people say, oh, Congress is dysfunctional. Congress this and Congress that. Congress, blah, blah, blah. You're not saying like we should overthrow the government and like tear up the Constitution, right? That would be fairly radical. But saying that Congress has a problem is not very radical. That's what's happening in this next phase of the kind of the petitions, right? Parliament is the problem. We're still loyal to the king. The final stage is that revolutionary stage. It is no. When we look at the Declaration of Independence, it's the king, the king, the king, the king. We all remember the preamble, or maybe we do. We'll read it. But if you were a colonist in 1776, it was the charges against the king that were ooh, that was the real tea, right? That's what you wanted to get to right away. But at this point in 65, please Parliament, please king. Demands are ignored. They want jury trial back. That's ignored. Still got the Admiralty courts. And this is where James Otis has the famous no taxation without representation. Again, not radical. It's not a radical statement. Like just using your eyes and brain. No taxation without representation. Where is the radicalism there? It's saying we would like members in Parliament. If you're going to pass taxes, we should have a say in it. If anything, it's saying we feel like second-class citizens, second-class British citizens. What we want is to be first-class British citizens. We don't want to be Americans. We want to be treated as equals. And we want to have some say over the way we do things here because it's different than what you're doing in London, right? Not radical yet. What is radical is some of the actions on the streets, right? Now, this obviously image is not from the 18th century. This is from recent history in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Another, right, purposeful crowd action, as your book would say it so gently about the colonists. The parallels, again, history does not repeat itself, but it's interesting when you draw these parallels to say, well, how is it different? How are the demands then? What were the demands then? What are the demands now? How is this moment of social upheaval and unrest and protest similar or different to ones in the past? It's actually very illuminating. And here you go, right? Colonists, they organize themselves, right? And they begin to boycott, right? So BDS, boycott, divest, sanction. This is a boycott movement where they're saying this is a form of protest. We're not going to buy your goods and you're going to see your economy suffer. And we'll look at that more in the second part of this lecture, that it actually does work. They're incredibly well organized. The Sons of Liberty are a violent group. They riot, they destroy symbols of unjust laws, they tar and feather people, they beat people up, they steal stuff, they burn down buildings. It's not just like, playing flutes and like, whatever, like eating apple pies or something. The Sons of Liberty are a violent, violent group. If you don't abide by the boycott, they catch you, sneaking tea or whatever later on with the tea taxes, you're going to get beat up, right? You're going to get like your stuff stolen. And people stick with it. Again, commons democracy. It ain't pretty. It's not always pretty. This idea of having a direct hand in how things get done, not always pretty, but it works. Young people, poor people are leading the protests. This is not the John Hancocks and Otises out like protesting. They're going to benefit, but it's largely young, poor people in the forefront, often violent protests. The governor of New York wants the army to fire on the protesters. Thomas Gage, the general, says, no way, not going to fire on the crowd. That'll start a civil war, rightfully so. And we'll have more on the what happens in a bit. Parliament does eventually appeal the Stamp Act. I'll talk more about that later. But they passed the Declaratory Acts in 1766, which say, like, we're going to backpedal on this one, but you colonists, we want to make sure to remind you that we have the power. Parliament has the sole power to pass any taxes we want, right? So that's a little bit of a threat, but we'll get to that more next time. What's happening in this time period, the ideologies of independence? The big one is this English stuff, right? English common law, parliamentary tradition. Again, writs of assistance. This is James Otis arguing against open-ended search warrants. This happens earlier on in the decade. Again, when we look at the Bill of Rights, you're going to see this, right? This illegal search and seizure is something that the colonists and the framers, as it were, of the Constitution are very concerned about. This has a long tradition in British common law, right? Of no illegal search and seizure, trial by jury, all of this kind of stuff. John Adams is evoking the Magna Carta, right? Many other colonists invoke the Magna Carta, as I said in the last lecture, right? Magna Carta has been reprinted since the 1600s, and this is something that British citizens, which the colonists are very, very proud of. They're also Protestants, many of them, very proud of Cromwell, early Cromwell, late Cromwell, kind of jumps the shark a little bit. Glorious Revolution with William and Mary coming to power, Parliament having more power, less power for the monarchy, all keen on that stuff. Enlightenment too. Yes, the Enlightenment is very, very important. Like, ooh, the Enlightenment. But like, look, come on. You think the average colonist is reading John Locke or the Baron de Montesquieu? Are you kidding me? Absolutely not. Yes, learned people are going to read this stuff. But if you're the average, colonist, it's the Magna Carta, it's English common law, it's parliamentary stuff, and it's exchange with England, right? There's radicals in England denouncing the king. I mean, way more radical than anything the colonists are saying. You've got English parliamentarians in the 1740s, 1750s, 1760s, who are saying not so nice things about the king. They have more rights to do that because they're they're actually British citizens in Parliament, but they come close to treason. And some of them do get actually tried for treason, John Wilkes being one of them. Montesquieu, a name you're probably not familiar with. He is as popular, if not more popular, a writer in whatever that means when it comes to like political philosophy and political economy. In this time period, more popular than Locke. He's French. This is a little taste of Montesquieu's view on republicanism. Again, very different from what we understand as democracy, right? Like democracy means you can buy Yeezys, right? Or like whatever, shoes for a $20,000 pair of shoes. Yay, it's a democracy. It ain't what they're saying in the 18th century. This is what democracy is to Montesquieu and to other kind of Republican citizens. To love democracy is to love frugality. Democracy ought to provide everyone with the same happiness and the same advantages, the same pleasures and the same expectations. This can be done only by frugality on the part of all. Bet you don't like the sound of that very much, do you? But that is Republican virtue in the mid to late 18th century. It is this idea of you have to have radical equality in order to have radical democracy. If you're going to have the people, the demos, being equal, you can't have some people rocking the Yeezys and other people, kicking rocks. There has to be a kind of radical frugality, a very Spartan existence. And that is the kind of mindset of a lot of the kind of early Republican virtues. Again, this is ancient republicanism, ancient democracy, tapping into Rome, tapping into Athens, places where citizens had a direct role in government. In order to have that kind of the hands-on relationship to government, you had to have a kind of radical equality. Again, slavery, women, poor people, all excluded, right? So like we can problematize the heck out of it. But at some level, it's a kind of radical notion. That's Montesquieu. And then traditions of common society, they're living it, right? So they're living this stuff. They're living that frugality. They're living that radical equality. They're living the purposeful crowd actions. If they don't like something, they get together and do it. We'll see this later with the Shays Rebellion, Whiskey Rebellion, all of these various rebellions, many of which happen after the revolution is won. And once the United States is a country and they need to govern, they kind of go, yeah, about that thing that you like doing, can't do it anymore. We'll get into more of that in chapter 7, I imagine, the difficulty of that. And some people in government like Jefferson say, great, let's do it. I'm all about that. Let's keep it in the old school model. Others, Hamilton, Washington, John Adams, Federalist largely, don't like it. Lastly, obviously, the contradictions of enslavers here being part of the mix. A lot of people want radical equality. People are using slavery as a metaphor. Meanwhile, right, enslaved people are like real slaves. It's not a metaphor. And enslavers wanted to keep this independence, right? Not so radical, right? Obviously not the enslaved, not poor people either. So again, I put this point in here just to remind us of something that's going to come out in the next couple lectures too. And this is true with all revolutions, right? Or many revolutions, whether it's a revolution largely led by like propertied, moneyed, well-to-do people like the American Revolution, or revolutions like the Haitian Revolution, which is led by the poorest of the poor, or the French Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Iranian Revolution, 79. All of these revolutions, just because there's a revolution doesn't mean everyone in the revolution agrees. They might all want the same thing: get rid of the king, get rid of the nationalist government, get rid of the Shah, get rid of the French enslavers, whatever. They might all agree on that, who the enemy is. But there's all kinds of ways in which the people fighting for revolution, once the revolution is won, you'll see real conflicts emerging between those various groups. Once the king is gone and people can look around and see who their allies are, we'll see that freedom for these people means slavery. Freedom for these people means abolition. Freedom for these other people means religious freedom. Freedom for these other people means like still being part of England. So we'll see that start to emerge. Once it becomes clear that the revolution is going in the way of the colonies, you'll start to see more of this. But we need to remember it's there from the beginning. From the very beginning, you have real disparate ideas. Some people fight the revolution for more freedom, for like white people. Some people fight the revolution for more freedom and want to abolish slavery. Some people fight the revolution to maintain slavery. Because they're afraid that the king is the final act of punishment, right? All of these various things. What if the final way that the king gets us is seizing our property And when our property is people, we don't like that. All of these various factions play a role in the revolution. So next time, we will get into a little bit more about how that all plays out. But for now, I am going to bed. And so should you if you're watching this late at night. See you soon.